The War of 1812 was a defining moment for the fledgling United States. For the young republic, this was not just another military confrontation, but a bold attempt to assert its sovereignty, validate its independence, and gain recognition on the global stage. Many Americans viewed the conflict as a continuation of the Revolutionary War, a chance to prove that they could stand against British might. Others saw an opportunity to expand the nation's borders, especially into British-held Canada, which they believed could become part of the US with minimal resistance. However, in the opening stages, these ambitions were met with a series of disheartening setbacks, highlighting critical weaknesses in American military planning, political coherence, and readiness. British forces, bolstered by strategic alliances with Native American nations, mounted a resistance that US commanders did not anticipate, setting the tone for the war's early years. This period is marked by pivotal campaigns and battles, the ill-fated invasion of Canada, the battles of Queenstown Heights and Detroit, and fierce naval clashes on the Great Lakes. Each encounter would shape American morale, adjust strategic aims, and mold public perception back home. At the onset of the war, the US Congress's pro-war faction, known as the Warhawks, was eager to seize Canada. Figures like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun viewed Canada as both a tactical target and a symbol of British influence in North America that needed dismantling. They believed that taking control of British North America would cripple British power on the continent, secure the Great Lakes, and open new lands for American settlement. President James Madison and his advisors were convinced that Canadians would welcome American forces as liberators, especially those who had previously emigrated from the United States. This confidence led Madison's administration to underestimate the depth of Canadian loyalty to Britain. Many Canadians, especially the loyalists who had fled the American Revolution, remained fiercely loyal to the Crown and were ready to defend their lands. In July 1812, General William Hull, a Revolutionary War veteran and the governor of the Michigan Territory, led a force of roughly 2,000 men northward from Detroit to invade Upper Canada, which is modern-day Ontario. Hull's army was composed mainly of raw, untrained militia whose morale and military discipline were questionable. Hull's mission was straightforward but ambitious: capture Fort Malden near present-day Windsor, Ontario. This stronghold would serve as a foothold for further advances into Canadian territory. However, Hull encountered serious logistical hurdles almost immediately. His troops struggled with scarce resources, long supply lines, and lack of experienced leadership. Many men were unaccustomed to the challenges of military life, which, coupled with Hull's cautious tactics, slowed the advance and created unrest among his ranks. Meanwhile, British Major General Isaac Brock, an experienced and charismatic leader, was quick to recognize Hull's vulnerabilities. Brock understood that fear could be a powerful weapon. To this end, he allied with the Shawnee chief Tecumseh, a fierce opponent of American expansion who had successfully rallied multiple native tribes under his leadership. Tecumseh's warriors were known for their stealth and tenacity, and their presence struck fear into Hull's forces. Brock and Tecumseh employed psychological tactics, staging bold displays to intimidate Hull's already hesitant troops. By strategically overestimating the size of his forces and emphasizing the alliance with the native warriors, Brock succeeded in planting seeds of fear and doubt in Hull's mind. This psychological warfare reached a climax on August 16, 1812, when despite having numerical superiority, Hull surrendered Detroit without firing a shot. The surrender was a humiliation for the United States, handing the British control of a key American fort and casting Hull as a figure of national shame. The fall of Detroit was a disaster for American morale, sparking public outrage and severe criticism of the war effort. Newspapers and politicians quickly decried the military's incompetence, raising doubts about whether the United States could hold its own in the war. Hull's surrender marked the first major setback, showing the American public and government that the road to victory would be far harder than anticipated. Following the debacle at Detroit, American leaders were determined to restore their reputation. In October 1812, they organized a second invasion of Canada, this time focusing on the Niagara frontier. Command of the operation fell to General Stephen Van Rensselaer, a member of New York's most prominent family, but a man with limited military experiences. His forces, about 3,000 strong, were composed mainly of poorly trained militia from New York and nearby states. His goal was to capture Queenstown Heights, a strategic high ground along the Niagara River. On October 13, 1812, Van Rensselaer launched his assault under the cover of darkness. Initial advances went smoothly. American troops managed to cross the river, scale the heights, and seize the British fortifications. However, logistical problems soon arose. The flow of reinforcements was interrupted as many militia soldiers, citing legal restrictions, refused to cross the border into Canada, leaving those on the heights isolated. British forces, led by the seasoned General Brock, mounted a swift counterattack. Though Brock was killed early in the fight, his courage and leadership inspired his men and their native allies to press on with a renewed vigor. The American troops fought bravely, but without reinforcements, were gradually overwhelmed. The battle ended in a resounding British victory, with hundreds of American soldiers either dead, wounded, or captured. The Battle of Queenstown Heights highlighted the American Army's disorganization and dependence on unreliable militia. It underscored the difficulty of maintaining cohesion and morale in the field, especially when faced with experienced British and native forces. For the Americans, this battle was another painful reminder of the challenges inherent in invading a well-defended foreign territory. While American forces faltered on land, the struggle for control of the Great Lakes took center stage in the war's naval theater. The lakes were crucial for transportation and supply routes, and control over them offered a strategic advantage. Initially, the British Navy dominated the Great Lakes, particularly Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. Despite the Royal Navy being stretched thin due to commitments in the Napoleonic Wars, their seasoned crews and well-equipped ships gave them an upper hand. To counter this, the United States placed its hope in Commodore Isaac Chauncey, a capable and determined naval officer tasked with building an American fleet from scratch. Chauncey faced a monumental challenge in assembling a navy. He lacked materials, experienced shipbuilders, and trained sailors. Nevertheless, he managed to establish a modest yet formidable American presence on Lake Ontario, engaging British forces in several minor skirmishes that helped his sailors gain valuable experience. Meanwhile, on Lake Erie, Oliver Hazard Perry, a young and ambitious officer, led the charge to wrest control from the British. Establishing his shipyard in Erie, Pennsylvania, Perry and his men worked under grueling conditions, constructing a fleet piece by piece with limited resources. By the summer of 1813, Perry had built a fleet capable of challenging British dominance on Lake Erie. On September 10, 1813, his fleet met the British in a climactic engagement. In the intense battle that followed, both sides suffered heavy casualties. Perry's flagship, the USS Lawrence, took severe damage, forcing him to transfer his command to the USS Niagara. In a heroic display of determination, Perry famously declared, "We have met the enemy and they are ours." His victory broke British control over Lake Erie, cutting off their supply lines and enabling American ground forces to advance into British-held territory. Perry's triumph was a turning point in the naval conflict, boosting American morale and demonstrating that British naval supremacy could be challenged. This victory on Lake Erie allowed the US to secure critical supply routes and support their forces on land, reshaping the strategic balance in the Great Lakes region. The early campaigns and battles of the War of 1812, marked by setbacks and occasional victories, had a profound impact on American morale and strategy. The initial failures in Canada highlighted weaknesses in the US military, particularly the reliance on untrained militia and the lack of effective leadership. Public opinion in the United States became increasingly divided as news of defeats like Detroit and Queenstown Heights spread. Many Americans began to question the wisdom of the war, particularly in the New England states, where opposition was strongest. In these states, Federalist leaders argued that the war was hurting the economy and damaging relations with Britain. Merchants and ship owners, who depended on trade with Britain, voiced their frustration, calling for a diplomatic resolution rather than continued conflict. The early defeats also exposed the need for better coordination and improved logistics within the American military. Secretary of War John Armstrong recognized these issues and implemented changes to address the shortcomings that had contributed to the setbacks in Canada. Despite the initial struggles, there were moments of hope and resilience. Victories on the Great Lakes, particularly Perry's success on Lake Erie, gave Americans a renewed sense of confidence and strengthened the resolve of military leaders. As the war continued, American leaders adapted their strategies, focusing on achievable objectives and building on their naval successes. The early campaigns provided valuable lessons that would shape the U.S. approach in the later stages of the conflict. In the aftermath of these early campaigns, the United States began to approach the war with a more pragmatic outlook. Military leaders recognized that the goal of conquering Canada was unrealistic and redirected their efforts toward defending American territory and securing control of key strategic locations. The early campaigns and key battles of the War of 1812 were a baptism by fire for the United States. The ambitious invasion of Canada, marked by the defeats of Detroit and Queenstown Heights, served as a harsh lesson in the realities of warfare and the challenges of expansion. The Americans quickly realized that their forces were outmatched and unprepared for the complexities of international conflict. Yet despite these setbacks, the victories on the Great Lakes demonstrated the resilience and determination of American forces. The early stages of the War of 1812 were a time of trial and adaptation. As the United States struggled to find its footing, the experiences gained during these initial campaigns would prove invaluable in shaping the country's future military strategies and diplomatic ambitions.